Welcome to the final day of the Student Leadership Conference. This week has been great. We've learned so much and want to thank all our presenters. Thank you for attending and participating. My name is Leah, and I will be your moderator for this afternoon session. Before I turn things over to our presenter, Carl Alexandri and Dr. Althea Maduramente, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. We ask that all participants keep their microphones on mute. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat or raise your hand. We'll keep track and we'll call on you throughout the presentation to go ahead and ask your question. Captions for today's discussion can be viewed using the closed caption button at the bottom of your Zoom screen or via stream text. If you experience any technical difficulty, please send a message in the chat and we will help troubleshoot. We will be recording today's session, but we will be sure to edit out anything personal before publishing to the website. All participants that stay for at least 85% of the presentation will automatically be entered into a raffle for some great prizes, including AirPods, a Kindle, or an air fryer. Participants can earn an additional entry by completing today's session survey. Lastly, we understand that the topics that we'll be discussing today may be intense or triggering. We encourage you to take a break if you need to. We'll be right here when you're ready to come back. Today's presentation, When They See Us, the psychological effects of microaggressions on students of color and immigrants in the classroom, highlights the effects of microaggression towards students of color and other minority groups in the classroom. In this session, our presenters will be tackling the biases and preconceived notions that professors may have towards individuals who may look and speak differently from the general population. Our first presenter, Carl Alexandri, is a social work intern at the Kingsborough Community College Counseling Center. He currently attends the College of Staten Island, pursuing a second master's degree in social work. He has his first master's in urban affairs from Queens College. He works as an advisor for the College Discovery Program at Kingsborough Community College. He enjoys community service and bringing awareness to communities that need the most support. He has also conducted community coat drives, food drives, and worked with various family shelters in providing resources that were needed. Each year, he hosts a community Thanksgiving dinner for families that may not have a place to eat for the holidays. As a social worker, he plans on providing counseling services as well to communities that are in need. Overall, he loves community service work. Our second presenter, Dr. Althea Maduramente, is the Director of Student Wellness Services at Kingsborough Community College. She has more than a decade of teaching, training, and clinical experience in a variety of college and university settings. Throughout her career, she has focused on creating more effective and efficient systems of service, teaching the next generation of clinicians, prioritizing multicultural consideration in clinical practice, and consultation and outreach aimed at reducing stigma and barriers to mental health care. Dr. Maduramente holds a PhD in counseling psychology from SUNY University at Buffalo, her master's degree in mental health counseling from CUNY Brooklyn College, and her bachelor's degree in neurobiology and behavior from Cornell University. With that, I turn it over to our presenters.
Hey everyone, hope your day is well. I hope that you are having a great day thus far as we tackle this topic. I hope that you guys can walk away a little bit more informed than what you are than what you've heard of or what you already know. So without any further ado, I'm going to share my screen. My colleague and I will tag in if there are any points that I may not be able to answer. She'll tag in and really highlight and answer some of these questions. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, great. So this segment is entitled When They See Us, right? So this is going to be an interactive presentation. So I'm going to ask for feedback. I may not be able to see what's going on in the chat. So feel free to talk, to ask questions, and let's have, let's try to make this as interactive as possible. So when they see us,
Carl,
right?
sorry.
Yes, hello.
Oh, I was gonna say, just tell them about why you titled it this way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So when they see us, one of the main things I wanted to highlight is what do you when people see you, right, off first impression, what do they think? What are their first impressions, right? So if we're just to look at the slide in general, right, asking you guys, what do you guys see in this slide, right? Just looking at the slide in general and looking at the title, what comes to light, or what comes to light, or what comes to mind? And those and that's the message, right? What's the common consensus of America when they see young Black men anywhere, right, in the classroom, or people of color, or immigrants, right, within out either in the streets or in the classroom, right? Sometimes personal biases are portrayed or highlighted, and what we want to do is create some sort of awareness of what, probably our own personal biases that comes out, and how is displayed, or how is it manifested when we interact with people that we may not know much about, right? So that's why it is entitled "When They See Us: The Psychological Effects of Microaggressions on Students of Color and Immigrants in the Classroom." So some of the learning objective for this segment is to identify what is microaggression, right? Create awareness surrounding the common occurrences of microaggression, and explore the experiences of students in the classroom, right? So throughout the segment, we'll be identifying, we'll create awareness, and we'll be exploring some of the experiences of what microaggression is, or what students experience. So we're gonna do our first poll, right? And the first question is, have you ever experienced any form of microaggression? There is a link that's gonna be put in the chat, and we will we'll start to just to get an idea of what's the consensus, what's the understanding of what microaggression is, or have you ever experienced any form of microaggression? The poll should be in the chat now. So let me so I just want to get a feel, if you guys can answer by a show of hands. Have you guys experienced any form of microaggression? Yes or no? You guys can also answer in the chat as well.
I like that there's a comment that says not in the classroom.
Mm,
And I think that's one of the things that we're going to try to highlight today is that, you know, people are able to see this sort of apply in outside the classroom probably much more easily. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what it is, and then some examples that are of obvious and not so obvious ways that you may have experienced microaggression. And then we're going to poll again to see if this is going to be if this actually has occurred to you. So right now there's 2 people raising their hands, right? I believe.
Yeah,
So
and we have
that
another comment in the chat,
okay.
at work, and then
Okay.
another participant said, yes, they've experienced.
So right now the poll is at 4. So let's see if that number changes.
okay, great. So what is microaggression? So if we're to identify it from just a dictionary standpoint, it reads this: a comment or action that subtly and often unconsciously or unintentionally expresses a prejudice attitude towards a member of a marginalized group, such as racial minority, right? From an article that I pulled, microaggressions are the everyday slights, insults, put downs, invalidations, and offensive behaviors that people experience in daily interactions with generally well-intentioned individuals who may be unaware that they have engaged in demeaning ways, right? If that's too wordy, if we're going to go back to the first slide, the previous slide, a simple comment of, you're really pretty for a dark-skinned girl, right? As nice as a statement sound, right? The person receiving it may take it as like, what do you mean as for the dark skinned girl, right? One of my own experiences at a previous job that where I worked at, I gave a presentation, and I remember the manager of the place came to me after the presentation was over, and he said, "Oh, you speak well." And as well intended as the comment was, uh, receiving it was, well, what did you expect? Like, did you expect anything different? So, little insult that that comes across where it may be well intended and maybe not. Some people may have other ulterior motives for why they say certain things, right? But it's little slight put downs. So I'm gonna play this first video, and we're gonna see what if it was reversed, right? Just on the other, if we were to flip the idea of microaggression, right? What does that look like?
So you're not good at golf, but you're white. People of color have to deal with racial microaggressions every single day. So microaggressions are those little unintentional insults that basically see people of color as stereotypes, which got me thinking, what if white people had to deal with racial microaggressions?
So like, where are you from?
No, like, where are you really from?
Why don't you have an accent? Like a Swedish accent.
You know, your English is really, really good. It's like I can't even tell you have an accent or anything.
I don't have an accent.
No, that's what I'm saying.
You don't speak Gaelic?
You don't speak German?
Can you say a curse word in European?
You know, like, what does that even mean?
Hey Connor, you know about NASCAR stuff, right? Can you take a look at this?
Can you teach me how to line dance?
Play the banjo?
Act entitled in the supermarket.
I love white food. There's no real flavor to it. Never an upset tummy.
You're so exotic.
How do you get your hair like that? I love how it's so limp. Ew, why does it feel like that? Oh my God, so it just does that? No, you are really pretty for a white girl.
Your eyes are so round, like this.
You know who you look like? Kenny Chesney. Zach Braff.
Emma Stone.
Rachel Maddow.
My friend Chad. Maybe you know him, because he's white too.
No, Emma Watson.
Not Macklemore. What's the other guy?
Is it Emma Thompson?
It's C-H-A-D, like Chad.
One of the Emmas. You look like an Emma.
You know who you look like? I bet you hear this all the time. Jeffrey Dahmer. How does it feel to be the token white guy in the office?
Hey, Connor, can we get a white perspective on this?
I love everything about white culture. You guys are like so fun.
What do you mean you don't listen to Creed? You're white.
You've never tried math. But you're white.
You don't act like a normal white person.
You're not really white, though.
You're not really white. I'm whiter than you are.
So, did all your ancestors own slaves?
No, but of course he wishes that he could still own slaves. That's a part of his culture.
Bryce, back me up on this one. The thing you have to understand about white culture
No, I
is
went
that
to
white
an
people are...
historically white college, so
okay,
I know about
but I
white culture.
backpacked
Okay,
in
was
Europe.
So can you say how ridiculous this was? I know. Story of my life. If you've ever experienced microaggressions because of your race, gender, sexuality, or body type, go ahead and vent about it in the comments.
Can you teach me how to like take a really popular rap song and like make it a ukulele song? It's so cool. I think it's so cool how you guys do that.
So yeah,
Sorry, can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
I think that, one of the things that this really highlights is how ridiculous it sounds going on the other end. But the other thing that I think Carl is really trying to highlight too is that, there are times when there are microaggressions where it's not so obvious, and that whenever someone has said something to you that kind of leaves you scratching your head about whether, like, how to take it, like something that sounds like a compliment, but you're not really sure, that I think would be probably the clue that something is going on in that comment that feels not right. Like, that's, if it's not sitting right with you, then you probably have been experiencing microaggressions in that particular moment when you're not sure where that comment is coming from. Even if you're sort of scratching your head saying, like, was that an insult or was that a compliment?
right, because even alluding to like my own experience where, the manager was like, "Oh, you speak well." Was it a compliment or what were undertone? What were you trying to say? So it's one of those things where you really start to question, should I feel offended or should I just take it as a compliment?
So,
right.
And Carl, one of
So
our
you're not-
participants actually said, "Oh my God, that was the microaggression I received at work." So they connected to that, your experience.
Kimberly, what was the microaggression you received at work? What particularly, what was that? If you don't mind sharing.
Okay, I don't mind sharing. And it was one of the ladies had said to me while we were having lunch. I was actually sitting with a couple of my friends that I eat lunch with, and we were sharing stories of what we did over the weekend. And the Caucasian lady had the nerve to say to me that oh, that Kimberly, she's such a beautiful woman for a dark-skinned woman. And the room got quiet. It was like 10 of us in there. And I couldn't say anything at that time. I didn't say anything. I just walked away, got out the room like as fast as I could. My friend, she touched me because she knew what I wanted to say.
Mhm.
I did approach the lady a couple of days later, and she apologized, and she was like, "Oh, well, I didn't mean it like that. I was just
Right,
saying that you were beautiful. Well, you should have said I was beautiful and not for a dark
right,
skin woman."
right. Yeah, it's a compliment with a condition, right? It's just that it's sort of you recognize that in their heads, it's not like an allowable space for you to just have that first part, that you can't own beauty because it belongs to something else, to someone else, some other race. I totally agree with you. I've had a similar experience as well. Oh, and actually, my wife has also had a similar experience. We were in the bathroom, and someone told her that she was too pretty to be a lesbian, which I thought was the most angering but also hilarious statement I've ever heard in my entire life. And that is part of the thing that we are also struggling with, right? When we experience these kinds of contacts with people, how do we respond? How do other people respond? And so that's, I think, one of the things that is going to be the really important part of this presentation as well. Carl is going to talk a little bit more about, what are the best ways to respond after we learn a little bit more about some examples, because we really want to drive home the point that this has probably happened. But we also want to drive home the point that you have probably done some of these things on your own without knowing it. So, and that's how insidious it can be.
And imagine some of our students who may not have the tools to answer that, right? When they're experienced a person of authority in the classroom, right? And what do I say? How do I combat that? How do I react? Who do I run to? So just think of some of the students and some of their own experience of what they've experienced in the classroom as well. So we're going to take another poll, being what we've identified what microaggression is, and some of you have shared what microaggression, what your experience has been like. Have you ever experienced microaggression, right? So I think there's a second poll in the chat, or we could just talk about it, right? I think
Let's take another show of hands, because I think because we can't access the polls.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
And then while the poll is happening, we do have another comment. The first time it ever happened to me in high school, a white girl complimented a biracial girl saying how beautiful she was and said to me, "I just look black."
So the original 4 has, now that we've sort of talked a little bit more about the examples, and I think this number is going to change as we keep going. How many people have experienced microaggression now that we've sort of talked about how insidious it can be, how sometimes not so explicit it can be? I can't
And
see
also on the
everyone.
and also on the flip side, think about some of your comments that you probably have made, not
Right.
unknowingly, right? That you've probably had these thoughts or complimented or said certain things that came across well intended, but the person receiving on the other end kind of took offense to it without you knowing. So just think about that as well, the duality of microaggression.
Okay, so we have 4 people who've experienced it. Okay, so now so are people raising their hands about experiencing it? Can we put down our hands, and then we'll raise hands about whether or not we have unintentionally microaggressed against others? I can't see all the participants, but I'm expecting there should be a lot more people who are raising their hands on this.
We have 5 raised hands so far.
Okay.
6.
I'm going to raise my hand.
We had 8.
Okay. All right. So 8 people.
All right, cool. So the idea is just we've identified it, right? And just kind of let it sink in your own experiences, right? Yeah. So we're moving forward, right? So types of microaggression, right? So the overall theme is microaggression in the classroom, but within that, there are sub themes or sub microaggressions that we need to identify as well, right? So the first one that we're gonna identify is micro assault, right? And that is the explicit derogation. Sorry, something is blocking me. Characterized primarily by a violent verbal, nonverbal, or environmental attack to hurt the intended target through name calling, avoidant behavior, purposeful discriminatory actions, right? So that's the micro assault. Micro insult is the communications that convey rudeness and insensitivity and demean a person's identity. And there's micro invalidation, which is communication that excludes, negate, or nullify the psychological thought, feeling, and experiential realities of people who experience microaggression, right? So think about for micro assault, people who who do things intentionally, whether it's physical, verbal, nonverbal, but it's very the assault is very intended for the person to be hurt, right? There's no kind of hiding whatever that they're trying to do. It's very purposeful what they're trying to do. Example that I could think of is saying, once again, using the same, oh, you're pretty for a dark skinned girl, right? Very blatant, you know what they're trying to say, right? You know that what are all Black girls, are they not beautiful, or Asian women, or whatever it is, it's very very intentional in what they're trying to communicate. Micro insults convey the rudeness and insensitivity demean in a person's identity, right? Some of the examples that we saw was, oh, when they're referring to like Asian people, why aren't your eyes round, right? And micro invalidations are just not taking into consideration some of the people's feelings, right? That never happens to you.
Sorry, in the chat, we have one sharing, once a fellow student wrote on a discussion board, people who choose not to go to college. This comment was upsetting to me because I work in social services and I know not everyone has a choice. Also, watching the video made me realize that I am guilty of being microaggressive to others even without intention. And then we have also a question. What about the microaggressions by people of color against each other? I guess that would be a whole different conversation. Kimberly wrote in the chat.
I think that's not actually a different conversation. I mean, what microaggressions are what we do to others and what others do to us that come from a different place than we are, from culturally, a social location than we are. So people of color can microaggress against each other based on, their assumptions of foreignness or assumptions of beauty. Even when we have sort of, westernized sort of standards of beauty and we apply it to our own races or other races, that's definitely a form of microaggression. And certain things that are not so obvious. Again, I think the statement about the forum is really true. People of different social classes, of different social histories can be microaggressive upon because people assume that they have choices, that that everyone has sort of similar choices, similar privileges, and similar rights, and they don't. And so that's a comment that is hurtful because you're assuming that a person is making an active choice not to better themselves. So you're saying that this person is choosing not to do something. And I think even when we think of it as a society, we can microaggress against other folks in the lower in a lower socioeconomic status. Yeah. So like when we vote on policies to make sure that our public spaces are not friendly to homeless folks, that's something that we are actually microaggressing against their comfort and validating their lives and saying, why don't they just live in shelters, things like that. These are, thoughts that can be, that you can see don't really have, they're not really limited to a certain group of people. Sometimes it really is, not coming just from one group to another. It's not unidirectional. People who have a privilege can microaggress against somebody who does not. And it doesn't really matter what the race or the status is of that person, as long as you have more power than the other person that you're microaggressing against.
And Jackie wrote in the chat, there's also microaggressions against people with disabilities.
Exactly. Yes, absolutely.
And could you imagine, like, a classroom contains all of these different sorts of individuals, right? You have people with disability, you have people from different socioeconomic status, you have people with different ideologies, you have people with different sexual preferences, you know, all contained in this one classroom. And once again, everybody comes in with their own biases. And also think about the professor's interaction with these different individuals with his or her own ideology, right? Of looking at a person with disability. Oh, you know, the work may be too hard for the person, right? Or looking at a person of Asian descent, looking at a person of African American descent, you know, looking at what a person looks like, you know, a person who is Muslim, right, with their traditional garment, or Sikh, or have traditional religious gear on, right? So this what the interaction may come across as, right? And how the person is receiving it, and how it's coming across. So everything contained in that classroom is very relevant, and unfortunately, oftentimes I've heard in my own experience where students come to me and say, man, like, I was trying to explain that I don't understand in the classroom, and the professor kept on saying, I don't understand what your accent is too strong. Or students being afraid to speak up because knowing that they have a heavy accent, or they're not from this country, and people may look at them differently, you know. So just think about all what we've talked about contained in one classroom, and how is that perceived, and how that energy is being shared back and forth. So we're going to try to identify some examples, and I'm going to need you guys to speak up. What are some examples of when we look at micro insult, micro invalidation, and macro insult, right? So inappropriate jokes, right? So what would that be? What do you think? What do you think that would be for inappropriate jokes? Would it be a micro insult, micro assault, or micro invalidation? And some of these topics could fall in multiple definitions, but just for a time's sake, I want to know, what do you guys think for inappropriate jokes? What do you guys think? I can't see the chat, so
Someone
you
said
guys.
insult. Someone said insults. Insults.
Insults.
Insults.
Okay, so let's see. Micro assault. That was my definition, right? Inappropriate jokes where, once again, is well intended to hurt the person. There's nothing hidden about it. It's well intended to hurt the person. But once again, it could fall under insult as well. Let's look at malicious comments.
We have in the chat micro invalidation / insult.
Okay, good. Singling out students.
I feel like we switched this. I feel like a malicious comment would be an assault versus an insult would be an appropriate joke.
Yeah, and once again, it could fall in different categories, but just, I guess, for time's sake. But you're definitely right. We're now looking at it.
I just think
singling out students.
I just think that sometimes, no, and I want to just clarify with everyone. The reason why I think it makes a difference sometimes is because, you know, it depends also on a person's intention. Sometimes we make jokes because we think it's funny, and we don't realize we think it's funny at the cost of someone else, which I think would be and more of an insult, and versus if we know it's funny because it's the cost of something else, that would be more of an assault because there's an intentionality behind it. And I think I think the assault, insult, and invalidation piece is really, I think, partly based on the person's intention behind why they say something.
That's compared to the malicious comments. Okay,
someone says it's not about the intent, it's about the impact. That's a good point.
That's a good point.
I stand corrected. I think that's a good point.
That's a good point. So let's look at C, singling out students. What do you guys think for this one?
Assault. Assault.
Assault.
Christopher Layden said.
Okay, stereotyping.
there is no wrong or right answer for people, by the way. I think that
there isn't.
All right, so there's stereotyping, there's the use of the term illegals for referencing undocumented students. Yeah, illegals are meant, that term is meant to demean that person. So these are some more obvious examples of microaggressions, which I think people are really clear when they see it, they can recognize it right away. But we also want to highlight the less obvious examples of microaggressions, and these might be things that you also may have done for yourself. If you're teaching students or have been in a classroom with students, and you haven't sort of given a second thought to doing something like this, this would be something where you might be the perpetrator of a microassault. So I think the first one is really, really important, and professors do this all the time. Setting exams and projects due dates on religious holidays. Like, they think it's a holiday that you should have free time, not knowing that, you know, let's say you're fasting or doing something really intensive or important at that point.
Seeing a student's dialect or way of speaking as an academic issue, once again, because you have an accent, or because you may have your dialect of English may be a little different, but they see it as this person may not be able to write an academic paper, or
understand the topic, or I have to speak more slowly, you know, or need more explanation.
Pronouncing a student's name incorrectly even after they've corrected you. That's another one. Having low expectations for students from particular groups, neighborhoods, or theater patterns. Refusing to acknowledge the experience of students by questioning their credibility and validity of their stories, right? Misusing pronouns or citing confusion even after a student, transgender or not, indicates their preferred gender pronoun.
This happens a lot, actually, I think, in our centers as well, or in other places where, you know, some staff will unintentionally say like, oh, like, I'm confused, what gender did they use? And I'm like, they identified the gender they wanted to use. It's not really that confusing what it is, because it's been sort of clearly identified. And, you know, people will cite like confusion about the, you know, their gender, a student's gender identity, or the pronouns that they want to use. You know, saying like it's confusing, or there's a lot of labels, or whatever. And for me, that sort of indicates just a refusal to learn or be flexible to adapt to the student's you know, identified pronoun or gender identity. And that's actually one of those things where it can be a microaggression if there's some resistance on your end to learn more about it, or to accept that the person's, you know, whatever they're giving you is valid and right for them.
We also have praising non-white students on their use of good English, right? Once again, my experience of, oh, you speak pretty well, or if a person is able to articulate properly, or you speak white, you know? So I don't know if you guys have ever experienced that, but once a person is able to articulate themselves pretty properly, the idea is you ascended into this idea of whiteness, right? Or you speak white. So especially for immigrants, or not, immigrants or students of color, some of these are some of the words they hear, or you speak well, or you speak white, or believing that students of particular ethnicities must speak another language or must not speak English, right? Because you look differently, the assumption is you're probably not from here, right? You're probably from somewhere else. Where are you from? No, really, where are you from? These sort of statements. So here's another media.
Wow, where's your accent?
My accent? My accent? Oh crap, did I lose my accent? I swear I just had it on me.
Okay, I get it. Yeah,
No, seriously, I don't know where I left it. It might be by the bench, hold on.
Oh, what?
It's not here.
Okay, haha.
Hello, 911? I'd like to report a missing accent. I'm here, live, with a young woman who has recently lost her accent. Please, if you've seen my accent, please give it back. Any idea where you might have lost it? I might have lost it at that job interview when no one could understand me, or at the drive-thru when they couldn't make out my order. Heartbreaking. I know it's a very, very sad story. My accent! It's been within me the whole time. I'd like to thank my mother, my father.
Once again, right, is this idea of because you look differently, automatically there is an assumption of you're not from here. You got to be from another country, or where's your accent? I thought don't everybody that look like you speak a particular way. So once again, these microaggressions that's constantly being used without people unknowingly, right? And once again, when we look at the context of within the classroom, the person of authority looking at students from because of their own personal biases or because of their own personal experiences with, I guess, or knowledge of a particular group, automatically will start to assume this person must have an accent, this person may not be from here, this person may not speak well, this person must be a terrorist, or this person must be violent, right? If there is a raise of voice, oh my goodness, I've seen this before. So all these things that is always being portrayed within the classroom, in the context of a classroom. So the impacts of microaggressions, right? So when we look at some of the impacts of microaggression, how does it really impact the students that are within the classroom? It says this: hurts and re-traumatize people who already experience oppression in a larger world. Feelings of pain that can accumulate and affect the students' overall health and well-being. Think about some of the students who come to the counseling center who are stressed out or have anxiety because of their own personal traumas. And once again, it's being reinforced by the person of authority within that classroom, or even by their peers, erodes any trust and credibility established with professor, staff, students, leader, and seen as someone who doesn't care about people like me. That's another theme where they don't care about me because of who I am, because of what I look like. Once again, that's always a common theme. By not leaning into and examining these situations, we miss learning opportunities for everyone involved, right? Because we don't have these certain conversations all time and over again. These are some of these opportunities that is constantly being missed, where we can learn from each other, where we can start to put aside our egos and start to really talk about well, I didn't know much about you. Well, teach me about you. Missed opportunities within the classroom. I'm gonna skip this yeah. Once again, continuing with the impacts of microaggressions, the students disengages and eventually drops out of school. Students start to feel alienated from their peers, decrease in class participation, and decrease of lack of study. Once again, from professors who create a violent environment within their classroom. These are the signs that start, and it could be other things as well, but when we, in the context of this microaggression, when we start to see a student starts to disengage, and a student who used to raise their hands for an answer or really participate in the school activity, they start to disengage. They start to kind of take the back burner because someone may have said something that made them feel bad, or once again, because of stereotypes that do exist, kind of well, I didn't think people like you were that smart. Once again, the students start to kind of back out in any sort of student activities. Students start to feel alienated because of what has happened in the news. I remember when the Boston bombing happened, or 9/11, Muslim students go through this all the time, or when there is a mass shooting, right? Or where there is, when you watch the news and something, a particular person from a particular ethnic group commits a crime, how do these students feel, right? Decrease in class participation and decrease in lack of study, low self-esteem, increase of stress levels, anxiety, depression, and suicidal thoughts. And students start to feel sad, angry, and hopelessness because, once again, it's like I'm in a losing battle. These are the same images that's always being portrayed of my people. These are the same stereotypes that always used to convey a message about my sort of people. Why am I even here? And you start to see, students have this idea of hopelessness. Well, it's never going to change. Let me just go through the pattern of life, and hopefully whatever happens happens. And it is our job as students or as our people of authority to kind of start to address and have these conversations, how to deconstruct things that I don't know about my own biases.
Hey, Carl, I also have like a really specific example. Like during COVID, there was a lot of violence and a lot of like negative portrayals of Asian folks, and so there was a feeling of just not feeling safe in classrooms, because people were assuming that they were sick or that they were bringing illness and things like that. And so, really the impact of this is that there's already a stress outside of their lives, and school, in some ways the academic environment is supposed to provide a safe haven for learning, for, like exploration, and people need safety and trust to do that. And when they don't get that, either because of more outright assaults, micro assaults or micro insults, or even just invalidating their experiences, then what happens is those that safety that is required for an optimal learning experience is not there. And so really, in terms of engagement, in terms of retention, in terms of success, how can we expect students to succeed when they are carrying a heavier burden than the rest of us? And it is different from these sort of overt assaults, right? I was telling Carl when we were having this discussion before, it's like death by 1,000 mosquito bites. And that's what microaggression is, right? So they're not big wounds that sort of traumatize that we normally see in the counseling center, these really, really large wounds. Most of these wounds are so small, they're pinpricks, but they're happening thousands and thousands of times over and over again. And so it's really hard to notice the threshold of how much you can stand. But at the end of it, you end up, it ends up being a bloodletting in some ways, right? Because if you're going through this years and years and years in your life, every day, small wounds like this, it's as devastating as a big assault.
Yeah. So how do we, once again, as individuals with our own sort of biases, how to respond to it, right? And I think that's where we're leading into. How do we respond to this, right? Putting aside our own biases, right? So when we look at micro resistance, right? Reframing defense to microaggression into a proactive focus on the structural nature of the problem, incrementally daily efforts to challenge the privilege, right? Well, what does that mean? It is a mouthful, right? Putting aside our own sort of privileges and kind of really understand what is the root of the problem, right? And making that a daily challenge for ourselves to really start to work on some of our own biases, some of the things that we struggle with, and really starting to educate ourselves in areas that we don't feel comfortable, right? Confront
and also
microaggression.
using our own privilege to challenge, right? So like sometimes we think of privilege as a really negative thing, or at least it's been framed in a negative way, but sometimes privilege can help sort of perpetuate a change. So these incremental daily efforts of challenging privileges, recognizing your own privileges, and then recognizing how to use that privilege to enact change, right? To use a voice that might be more willingly heard by other people, to advocate, things like that. But also to recognize where those sources of biases might come from as well, and to consistently do a lot of self-work so that you can also challenge the system, right? So people doing a lot of self-work and end up challenging the system because they notice things a lot faster. So they can stop themselves from doing so, they can stop colleagues from doing it as well. And then they can, they can sort of verbalize or advocate for folks that don't have as much privilege, and they can be the voice of someone who may or may not even be noticing that those things are occurring to them yet.
and once you are aware of your own privileges and how you can become an ally, right? You start to teach others, right, about what you've learned about your own biases, about your own microaggression, about your own experience in either being a victim or the perpetrator, right? And now you are telling a friend, hey, this is what I've learned, and these were some of my experiences, whether I was the victim and I received microaggression towards me, or I was the perpetrator, not unknowingly, right? And now you're starting to build this network of enlightened folks, right? So they can be aware of their own microaggressions and build more micro resistance for other people, for other marginalized communities. And it's just, once again, a daily effort, and it's a continual work of, well, how can I best educate myself to make people around me feel more comfortable?
And I also want to just thank you, Leah. I also wanted to also highlight, you can move to the next slide, Carl, that micro resistance can also mean, validating others, right? So sometimes it helps when I say ally someone or advocate for someone, sometimes it's as little as sort of acknowledging that that experience occurred, right? So one time somebody happened to speak with me, and she specifically said, "Oh, I thought you were this other person." And I said, "Oh, really? That wasn't me." She goes, "Yeah, this was another Asian-y person." And I was, obviously taken aback by that. And I didn't know what to do or respond. And the person walked away. And the person next to me was like, "Wow, I'm sorry." And I felt validated that someone was looking at that experience and felt the same way as I did. Right. And sometimes that's as little as that, that's the action that you can provide to someone by validating that experience occurred, and that experience, whatever they're feeling is valid, can be enough. We see that in the counseling center all the time, right? Students sometimes they're not necessarily wanting to go into action. Maybe they just want to know that someone has, seen them, right? Someone has seen that experience and as taking a stand with them. And that can be where you can start.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And once again, if you are unsure if it was an experience, right? Kind of clarifying what was said, just to make sure you heard what you said was right? So clarifying what was said to check your own assumptions. I think I heard you say X, Y, and Z. Is that right? Just to get a clarity on what was said, and for you to have an opportunity to process that sort of what was said, and gives you an opportunity, if needed, to respond in a mature manner, right? Be sure to focus specifically on the person's exact actions or words they use, rather than who they are as a person, right? When people hear judgment or accusations about who they are, especially if called out in front of others, their defense go up, and they usually cannot take in a new perspective or learning, right? Or share the impact that it had on you. When I heard things like, you're pretty for or you speak well for a Black person, how did that make you feel? And don't be afraid to speak up about how that made you feel uncomfortable, or how this person wasn't aware of their comment and how it impacted me, right? So not being afraid to speak up once you gain clarity and understanding of what's being said, and kind of an idea is just to, if given the opportunity, process what was said, right? Process what was said, and if needed to respond, you could respond.
And also, like, if people are well intentioned, right, and which most people claim to be, especially given that we've probably done some of our own microaggressions to others, most of the time they usually come from a place where someone is trying to intend something else, or not usually, but sometimes come from a place. So that person hopefully is willing to have a conversation to recognize that there's been a negative impact by their actions. And so you want to make sure you maximize the impact of that conversation by sort of attending to your own feelings, and then being able to communicate what that feeling is, and giving another person an awareness and an opportunity to learn from that experience. And I think that if they are well intentioned, they'll be open to having that conversation. And so I also want people to kind of reflect on themselves as well. If you ever get sort of feedback like that, to be open to that. It may feel it may feel embarrassing, it may feel a little scary to have someone call that out, but it's also part of the aspect of change is that self-reflection, and being able to receive feedback and provide feedback, so that in the end, there is a shift in the culture when it comes to communicating things to others.
And so some so the key thoughts that we can take away from this is often we're when faced with a problem, one of the best ways to solve it is to learn more about it. This is true for microaggression as well. Learning more about what it is, how it functions, and what kind of causes and effects it may have helped you deal with it in the long run, right? It's also wise to learn about other people live and find out more about different social groups to begin eliminating any unconscious associations you might feel towards them. So it's a constant self-work. It's a constant reevaluating what you were taught when you were growing up, or even within your community, what you were taught, and kind of bringing to light, man, I was taught this, or within my community, this is our perception of life. But now being able to re-engage or relearn what you've learned, and just to create just sort of an ongoing change of I want to learn more, I want to engage more, and the beauty of it, you could do it at your own pace, right? No one is forcing you. There's no timeline of when the change needs to happen, but as long as you're conscious about the change that you want to make, and I think that's the key point. You want to make that change. You want to be more informed. You want to be more enlightened by the things that you don't know about. I think there's a saying: the more you know, the more you find out you don't know. So it's constant relearning, reevaluating. How can I better myself to put aside these biases that was taught to me or passed down to me traditionally by my group of people, or my ethnicity, or my community.
Carl, just a heads up, we're almost out of time.
Yeah, I think that's it. This is the end. Be aware of our own biases that often translate into microaggression. We can either be the perpetrator of microaggression, or the victim of it. Don't be afraid to learn and explore other groups and cultures that we are not familiar with. And that's the end of the presentation. So I'm gonna stop sharing, and
we actually have the survey for the presentation at the end, and in the chat. So for folks, we hope that you have learned something. You can feel free to ask us any questions in the 2 minutes that we have left.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carl and Dr. Maduramante. I'll just read this in the comment, and then I have just a few closing announcements I have to make. So Christopher shared in the chat, the university, if not CUNY per se, has existed for centuries as an incredibly conservative institution with faculty at the apex of conformity. Actually, this is a question. How can we remake the system that was designed for gatekeeping knowledge and power so that it is welcoming to a wider range of identities?
I mean, that's a huge question. That's a huge question, and I think the answer is actually a very small answer. And when I say that, I mean, like any change, sometimes it occurs in one big, like, sort of false swoop, and most change, typically the most dynamic, usually happen gradually, because that's, people are more willing to make change in that regard. But sometimes there's big social changes that happen because of larger cultural shifts or larger events that occur. And we've seen lots of those in our lifetimes, probably more than most. So the pandemic was one, I know 9/11 was another. So all of these things sort of shift and change. And I think everything sort of has a season. So sometimes change is more willingly taken when it's in vogue in a lot of ways. But I think what happens is we have to sort of have a consistency about wanting to change. The small steps have to be taken consistently, and more and more people have to be aware of the need for the change first. So education, small grassroots movements are usually really helpful, with the help of much larger movements that occur, once in a while. But it's a large community that's been established for centuries. Change does not have, just like any kind of change in large scales, it happens both in small and massive ways. And I think what we can do is the small things. If people have the energy for the larger changes, I certainly welcome them to do it. And there are people who are much more active about that. And if you have the spirit and the energy and the enthusiasm for doing so, I would certainly hope that you do.
Especially in the classrooms, I think that's where I would say it also takes place as well, especially when we're interacting with students, with peers, with faculty, with any sort of administration. That's where it really begins, in these small offices in the classroom. That could start some sort of change.
And we'll go to one last question or comment with Reshma.
Hi, just a comment. Microaggressions can have so many impacts. They can invalidate someone's individual experience and existence when a comment or action is rooted in a stereotype. Or for instance, when a person of color is followed in a store, this perpetuates harmful and, might I say, deep emotional impact on communities and individuals. They continuously feed into our system of oppression. They feed into our legislation that perpetuates inequity. They feed into internalized racism, ableism, homophobia, etc. And these things become so ingrained that it takes a level of awareness and everyday continuous work to make ourselves better in an effort to make the world better. One workshop in higher ed on unconscious bias will not do the work about unlearning all of these biases because these things are so subconsciously embedded in our verbal and written communication, in the jokes that we tell, in the compliments that we give, and even in the small daily actions. That was my spiel.
Agreed. I mean, any sort of thing, something so big like this. Someone asked what provoked the need for this session. It's because it's everywhere, and I think there has always been a need for conversations like this. And this conversation, one session is not going to be enough, because it needs to be a consistent, dynamic, shifting, and ever-present sort of conversation. It needs to be like alive. Like, this is not something that's sort of needs to be a static conversation where you learn and then you move on. I think multicultural competence and self-reflection of this kind is necessary on a daily basis. It's a daily practice, and like I said, the change happens in small, and the bigger changes usually happen in these small ongoing ways, rather than these one-off events, or one big shift.
Now that we're charged, now that we have become aware, how can we start to create change within our own communities, right? Like a wildfire, it starts with one person, and I know this may not happen immediately or as in a macro setting, but as long as now we know the information, now we're tasked with the responsibility to start making these changes in our own circles.
Yeah, keep it going.
Again, thank you so much, Carl, Dr. Maduramante, everyone here. On behalf of the Student Leadership Planning Committee, I thank you for joining us today. This was a very important presentation. Thank you for joining us this whole week, and we hope that everyone is well. We wish you a great rest of your Friday, a great weekend, and thank you everyone so much. And don't forget to complete the survey. It will enter you into another chance for a raffle for some great swag and prizes. Thank you so much, everyone.